Subordinating conjunctions. A subordinating conjunction is used with a subordinate clause. A subordinate clause is a clause that doesn't make sense on its own as a sentence. It's a dependent clause. Essentially, the subordinate clause doesn't express a complete thought on its own. Therefore, it depends on an independent clause to make sense. A subordinating conjunction is used to join a dependent clause with an independent clause. So, if the sentence begins with an independent clause, followed by a dependent clause, then we don't need to put a comma in between. However, if the sentence begins with a dependent clause, followed by an independent clause, then we need to put a comma between them. Let's look through some examples. Jay ate a lot of food because he was hungry. Here, the independent clause is Jay ate a lot of food. This makes sense on its own. The dependent clause is because he was hungry. Here, the dependent clause provides more information about the independent clause. So it tells us why he ate a lot of food. So because the independent clause is first, then followed by the dependent clause, we don't need to put a comma between the two. As you can see, the subordinating conjunction because is used to join the two clauses. Although Jay was hungry, he didn't eat any food. Here we have a subordinating conjunction followed by the dependent clause, then the independent clause. Although Jay was hungry, this clause alone doesn't make any sense. Therefore, it's a dependent clause. He didn't eat any food. This makes sense on its own. Therefore, it's an independent clause. Because the dependent clause comes first, followed by the independent clause, we put a comma between the two clauses, like this. Another example is, after Sam does his homework, he watches TV. So as we can see here, after Sam does his homework doesn't make sense on its own. We would require more context to understand what the clause is about. Therefore, this is a dependent clause. He watches TV makes sense on its own. Therefore, it's an independent clause. So following on from the rule that we learnt about, if the dependent clause comes first, followed by the independent clause, then a comma is required between the two clauses. Sam watches TV after he does his homework. The clause Sam watches TV makes sense on its own. Therefore, it's an independent clause. After he does his homework doesn't make sense on its own. Therefore, it's a dependent clause. Again, following on from the rule that we learnt, if the independent clause comes first, followed by the dependent clause, then we don't need a comma. Okay, let's go through one last example. Try to figure out which clause is the dependent clause and which clause is the independent clause. I turn all the lights off before I leave the house. So here, I turn all the lights off is an independent clause because this makes sense on its own. Before I leave the house. This is a dependent clause because it doesn't make sense on its own. We would require more context in order to understand what the clause is talking about. Before I leave the house, I turn all the lights off. So here, before I leave the house is the dependent clause because it doesn't make sense on its own. I turn all the lights off is the independent clause because it makes sense on its own. Now I will go through the common subordinating conjunctions in English. After, although, as if, as long as much as soon as though, because, before, by the time, even if, even though, every time, if, in case, in order that, in the event that, just in case, lest, now that, once, only if, provided that, rather than, since, so that, supposing, than, that, though, till, unless, until, when, whenever, where, whereas, wherever, whether or not, whether, while,